When women choose partners when they're using hormonal birth control, they tend to de-emphasize the extent to which they value qualities related to sexual attraction, right? They tend to prefer less masculinized male faces, and they tend to prioritize other cues that have absolutely nothing to do with sex.
Like what?
So for example, a man's provisioning ability. So is he going to be a stable, financially providing partner? Is this somebody who's going to be somebody that they see as potentially a good father? And obviously these are incredibly important things, right?
Yeah.
Most women who are choosing long-term mates wouldn't look at that list of characteristics and say, this is a terrible decision, right? It's terrible, but it's going to lead you to something a little bit different, right? And sometimes
more stable.
Well, yeah.
More secure.
More stable, more secure.
More feminine.
Yeah, more feminine. And what's really interesting about this is that when researchers have done studies where they looked at the divorce rate of women who chose their partners when they're on or off the pill, and women who choose their partners when they're on the pill are less likely to get divorced. But when they do get divorced, they're overwhelmingly the ones who initiate it, which is also really interesting.
Okay, you guys, this is going to be a goodie. We have Dr. Sarah Hill on the podcast today, who is an evolutionary psychologist. By the way, I want you to tell us what that is. But she is someone who talks all about hormones, the effects of birth control. You wrote a whole book on this, and mating, which is, again, I love all your stuff. So I'm so happy you're here today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. And I will tell you what an evolutionary psychologist is.
Please.
So I'm a psychologist, and the thing I'm really interested in is trying to study behavior and motivation. So I'm really interested in why people do things that they do. And the lens that I use to do my research is that of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. And all that means is that I use the tools from evolutionary theory to make new predictions about why people do the things that they do and think the things that they think and feel the things that they feel. And yeah.
That's it. That's a great summary of what you do. But then you wrote a book about birth control, and but you wrote that book a while ago. But it's been seeming to get a lot of traction recently.
Yeah. So I did. So I wrote the book in 2019. It was published in 2019, and I spent my research career studying women and trying to understand, especially sexual motivation. That has been sort of my bread and butter in research, is trying to understand women's motivational states with respect to sexual relationships. And then I went off the birth control pill that I had been on for more than a decade of my life. And when I went off of it, I felt like I woke up. I felt like I went from a black and white line drawing into this full dimensional, colorful reality. And I kept asking myself, is there something about those hormones that I was on that influenced me? And, it's funny because I had published in my research that I had done, throughout my career studying women and women's psychology, published papers about the ways that women's hormones affect their motivational states and sexual desire and everything else. And it never even crossed my mind that these synthetic hormones that I was taking were then, of course, also going to influence the way that my brain worked and the way I felt and the way I experienced things. And so I went to the research literature to see what had been published on birth control pill and women's brains. And I saw that, oh my gosh, there's all this research that's been around for 30 years that nobody's ever told anything about. And so that's what ultimately led me into that research area to really begin to uncover what we know and don't know about hormonal birth control in the brain. And as you noted, I did publish this in 2019, and it's really, in a lot of ways, it was a little bit before its time because people weren't really having these conversations yet about birth control. It's really been in the last 2 years or so that things have really exploded, and women are really interested in trying to better understand, one, what do birth control pills do to their brain and the way that they experience the world? But then also, who are they off of it? And trying to better understand the role of their hormones and everything else in the way that they experience the world.
So why do you think now, or 2 years ago, it became such a hashtag worthy topic, like hormones? It's become very trendy. It's very big, like you said. What do you think, what was the trajectory that all of a sudden people are really talking about this now?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I've always wondered it myself. I mean, I think it was a combination of, I think that the pandemic made us all look inward just in terms of our health and trying to understand our bodies. It gave us a lot more time because we had time on our hands during that time to try to educate ourselves. So I think that there was a little bit of that where people were kind of trying to understand their bodies a little bit more during the pandemic because they were trying to keep themselves healthy in the face of this, unpredictable kind of a virulent threat. But I also think that just as the next generation of women has sort of started to, phase out of the reproductive years, and younger women have sort of moved into that space, this is a much more savvy population in some ways. Like, I'm a Gen Xer. And, when I was growing up, if my doctor gave me something, I never thought twice about it. I didn't think about what was in my tampons. I didn't think about anything. I mean, it was just like, oh, okay, this is like what you take and this is what you put in your body. And you know what I mean? And the younger generation of women are suspicious of that. And they're like, wait a minute, like, what is in these tampons? And, sure enough, it's a bunch of chemicals.
Right.
And now there's like labels on there and we know what's in them. And so I think as these women who are a little bit more suspicious of the idea of just put something in your body and shut up, little lady, that they're not willing to put up with that. And so I think that these younger generation of women, in their quest to try to better understand what's going into their bodies, has really begun to do a deep dive in trying to understand the impact of synthetic hormones, and in particular the pill, on the way that their bodies sort of experience the world.
So let's talk about that, because I think this is how I found you. Because you initially started talking about how our brains are very different and our choices, our life choices, are very different when we're on birth control versus when we're not on birth control. Can you just talk about some of these major things that change our brains when we're on synthetic hormones?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that we need to do is just orient ourselves to a naturally cycling woman, right? So this is somebody who's not using hormonal birth control. And let's learn a little bit or talk about a little bit about what their hormones do. And so if you are a naturally cycling woman, meaning you're not on the pill, but you're having cycles, the first day of your cycle is the day you get your period, right? So that's why your doctor's always asking, when was the first day of your last menstrual period? It's because that is the start of your cycle. And at that point, your levels of sex hormones are really low. So even though women get a hard time all the time about, being hormonal because they're having their period,
totally.
that is like literally the time in the cycle when our hormones are at their absolute lowest. And when our hormones are really low, that tells our brain that it needs to stimulate our ovaries to begin egg follicle maturation, right? So our brain tells our ovaries, start working on some eggs. And as those eggs are beginning to develop, that leads to the release of estrogen, right? And as the eggs are maturing and developing and getting ready to ovulate, estrogen levels rise. And so for naturally cycling women during the first 2 weeks of the cycle, it's characterized by this nice, beautiful rise in estrogen that corresponds to the period of time in the cycle when sex can lead to conception, right? And so it's not surprising that what we tend to see with research in estrogen is that when estrogen is high and rising, like getting close to ovulation, women experience increases in sexual desire. They feel sexier, they have more sex, they're more likely to have orgasms, they have more energy, they're more attuned to all things related to mating. So they notice men, they can decipher the scent differences between different types of men, they're cued into testosterone levels in men, and all of these things correspond to this big rise in estrogen that women get right prior to ovulation, because this is the time in the cycle when sex can lead to conception, right? And so it's like evolution by natural selection made our brain primed for mating and the ability to sort of distinguish between high and low quality mates at this time when estrogen is high and rising. So then you ovulate, and then that empty egg follicle actually becomes a temporary endocrine structure, and it starts to release a second sex hormone called progesterone. Right, so the first 2 weeks are characterized by this high and rising levels of estrogen, right? That corresponds to the release of the egg, women feeling great and happy and sexy and flirty and noticing men. And then all of a sudden their estrogen levels crash, and instead it's replaced by the second sex hormone, progesterone, which remains relatively elevated for the last 2 weeks of the cycle. And during this time, women are hungrier, they're sleepier, their energy levels are lower, they tend to be more emotionally a little bit all over the place. In psychology, we call it labile, right? It's like when you're kind of moving around a little bit.
What's it called? Labile?
Labile, isn't that a fancy word for
Yeah.
like being kind of all over the place?
Right. Like scattered.
Yeah, a little
Yeah.
emotionally, sensitive. And so for a naturally cycling woman, you get this nice rise in estrogen, which is characterized by one set of states, usually related to sexual desire and attraction. And then you get the second half of the cycle, which is characterized more by emotional sensitivity and tiredness and hungry and all of that stuff. And so this is important to keep in mind because this is what the normal sort of state of affairs is for
Okay.
women. Now, what happens with the birth control pill is all of that gets shut down. Okay, so you take this pill and it tells your brain, do not stimulate your ovaries, right? And so your ovaries never start maturing egg follicles. You don't release estrogen. You don't release an egg, which is why you don't get pregnant. You don't release progesterone. Instead, you take this daily synthetic set of hormones, which is comprised of a level of the synthetic progesterone, which is called a progestin, right? And it is what fools the brain into not stimulating the ovaries. And then a relatively low level of estrogen. And so every day women get the same hormonal message. And that hormonal message is relatively high level of synthetic progesterone or progestin, low level of estrogen. And so this, of course, creates a state when you're getting the same message repeated every single day. This creates a very different state than that beautiful waxing and waning between like sexual desire and feeling sexy and alive and energetic, and then feeling a little bit tired and sleepier and hungrier. And instead, it makes the same daily hormonal message that is one that tends to be characterized by relatively low levels of sexual desire, low energy levels, more sleepiness, a greater risk of depression, and you don't get those big surges in feeling sexy or sexual desire or any of these other things that we tend to see in naturally cycling women. And instead, you get the same daily hormonal message every day. And so it creates a very different state.
So it kind of blunts your emotions in some way.
Yeah, it does.
It blunts your like highs and lows. Your so what because of that, you say we make different choices. So you're saying in like that we would pick and choose different mates and partners even based on that.
Right, we could. So here's what the research tells us. So one of the things that we know about estrogen when it's moving across the cycle for a naturally cycling woman is that when estrogen levels are high and rising, this is related to an increased preference in cues that are related to, for example, genetic compatibility. So women prefer the scent of genetically compatible men when estrogen levels are high, and they're not able to tell the difference between them when they're at low fertility. And so estrogen primes our brain to be more sensitive to these fine-tuned differences between men, and women are able to distinguish between genetically compatible and incompatible mates and are more dialed into those that they're compatible with in a way that they're not at low fertility. We also know that when estrogen is high in the cycle, that women express a greater preference for facial, vocal, and behavioral masculinity in men, meaning that they prefer men with more masculinized male faces, with sort of more social dominance in their like personalities.
When they're not on the pill.
Yeah, when they're not on the pills. This is all women when they're at that high estrogen point in the cycle, because your brain is primed for mating. And evolution by natural selection has shaped our brain to be sensitive to levels of estrogen. And when estrogen is high, it turns up the volume on all things related to being able to decipher between, good and maybe less good mates. And it also increases women's attention. I mean, it just makes them more sexual. They are just like more dialed into their sexuality. Right. So that's with naturally cycling women. When women are on the pill and you're not experiencing this, so you're not getting that big surge in estrogen, you never experience that shift that's going to lead you to have a greater preference for example, masculinized male faces and voices and behaviors. You're not going to get that shift that leads you to be able to tell the difference between men who might be genetically compatible and incompatible based on their scent. You're also not going to be motivated to choose a partner based on sexual attraction, because your sexual attraction and just sexual desire tends to be dampened. And so what we tend to see is that when women choose partners, when they're using hormonal birth control, they tend to de-emphasize they tend to de-emphasize the extent to which they value qualities related to sexual attraction, right? They tend to prefer less masculinized male faces, and they tend to prioritize other cues that have absolutely nothing to do with sex.
Like what?
So for example, like a man's provisioning ability. So is he going to be a stable, financially providing partner? Is this somebody who's going to be somebody that they see as potentially a good father? And obviously, these are incredibly important things, right?
Yeah.
Most women who are choosing long-term mates wouldn't look at that list of characteristics and say, this is a terrible decision, right? It's terrible, but it's going to lead you to something a little bit different, right? And sometimes
More stable.
well, yeah, and
More secure.
yeah, more stable, more secure,
feminine.
yeah, more feminine. And what's really interesting about this is that when the researchers have done studies where they looked at the divorce rate
Yeah.
of women who chose their partners when they're on or off the pill, and women who choose their partners when they're on the pill are less likely to get divorced. But when they do get divorced, they're overwhelmingly the ones who initiate it, which is also really interesting.
Really?
Yeah, and so it suggests that it does lead to more relationship stability in some ways because you're sort of choosing based on your head,
Not your heart.
not your heart. But that, of course, comes at a cost. And for some women, what happens when they go off of hormonal birth control and they do start cycling again, and all of a sudden they're going through these periods of estrogen surge, if all of a sudden they don't like what they see or what they smell in some cases, then it leads them to become less sexually attracted to their partner. And sometimes it can lead to relationship breakups. And so what tends to happen, and there's been research that's looked at what happens when we follow couples longitudinally, so over time, when they've gotten together, when the woman was using hormonal birth control, and then she discontinues it later on. And what researchers find is that if women chose their partners when they're on the pill, go off the pill, that it does lead to changes in attraction and sexual desire with respect to their partner. But for some women, it gets better. So if they just so happened to choose a partner who had those qualities that their naturally cycling self likes, that it's associated with an increased sexual attraction to their partner, more sexual desire, and they have more sex. But for some women, it leads to the opposite. And the women discontinue it, and all of a sudden they don't feel attracted to their partner. Their sexual attraction to them decreases, and then it causes relationship problems. And so essentially what it's doing is it's taking the blinders off.
Yeah.
And so some of the time when you take the blinders off, it's kind of like the show on like Netflix, like Love is Blind.
Yeah, Love is Blind.
Right. Yeah. It's like you choose a partner without, with the little mask on.
goggles on,
Yeah, the
yeah.
goggles on. You have no idea what they look like. And sometimes you pull off the goggles and it works. Sometimes you pull off the goggles and it doesn't work. And that's pretty much what is going on with hormonal birth control. It's because it's a little bit of a different version of yourself who is choosing that person than who you are once you're off of it.
So how about on the male side? Are they, because if you're picking if the females certain things are dampened, like her sexual libido and her desires and all these other things are like more dampened. What kind of man is attracted to a woman on birth control versus one that's not?
That's like such a fascinating question. And nobody's asked the question quite as you just asked it. Right. And that's a really interesting question. And something that I'll totally have to go back to the lab and research. But what they have done is they have looked at the extent to which the extent to which men desire women who are either using or not using hormonal birth control. And what research generally finds is that lo and behold, men are more attracted to women when they're naturally cycling, particularly when they're at a high estrogen part in their cycle. Right. And one of the things I talk about in my book is this really brilliant study that was done. This was done several years ago now, that was done at a strip club. And they had all of the women who were working there as dancers keeping a diary. And they indicated whether they were using hormonal birth control or not. Right. And then every day they just simply wrote, did they get their period today or not? And how much money did they earn? Right. And so they were able to look at all of the dancers, their tip earnings over the course of 2 menstrual cycles. And then they were able to divide the women up based on whether or not they were using or not using hormonal birth control. And what they found was that for women who are naturally cycling, so again, experiencing their own hormones, you get this really sharp increase in tip earnings that are corresponding right around high fertility. So they're earning more money when estrogen is high in the cycle than they are when estrogen is low in the cycle. And these women are out earning the pill takers whose earnings were relatively flat across the cycle. They were out earning them by several $100s a shift. And so just going to show that even, and
Wow.
we don't know what it is about that. Like, was it something about the way the women were moving because they were feeling sexier? Is it something about the way that they smell? Because we also know from research that men prefer the scent of women at high fertility compared to low, suggesting that men can pick up on estrogen levels by scent, which doesn't really make a whole, it's not very surprising because many cells in the body express estrogen. And so we would expect that this would be the case. But men do seem to pick up on the scent of estrogen. And so it could be that. It could be that the women are dressing sexier when they're I mean, we just have no idea exactly what it is, but men seem to be picking up on it. And they prefer that. And so those women earn more money than the women who are naturally or who are using hormonal birth control because men are dialed into cues of fertility, right? And again, evolution by natural selection would have it no other way than for a man to be most turned on by women at times when conception is possible. Because men who had that tendency, they would have passed down a greater number of genes because those are the women that they would be sleeping with.
That is so interesting.
Yeah, totally.
And like these are not things that you ever would think about, right? Like
No.
partner choice and all of these things. What is like the percentage of women, do you know, that are on birth control
So I
in
don't
different
know.
age brackets?
Different age brackets. So by far the most frequent users are women in their young, like early 20s.
Yeah.
Like 20 to 30 is like the big age range. 20 to 25 in particular is like really hot. And in some cases, I've seen population estimates as high as like 40% or something. Like it's very, very high. And then it falls off. And this is the group of women who's usually most motivated to avoid pregnancy. I mean, a lot of these
Right.
women are in college or trying to build their careers or, just trying to avoid parenthood for other reasons.
Right.
And
What about IUDs? How about that?
yeah, well, so the it depends on what IUD you're talking about.
But there's
Because
two, the copper one.
the copper one doesn't have the
Any of-
hormonal effects, right? And so that is definitely one that I would recommend for women who are willing to try it. I know it sounds really scary and barbaric, and so not everybody's like game to want to have that put in. And doctors are getting better about it. They used to not want to give that to women who hadn't had kids because they're like, oh,
Really?
yeah, but they're getting over that position, thankfully. But so yeah, that is a non-hormonal option that is obviously incredibly effective. It tends to, besides, you do tend to get heavier cramping and bleeding with that. But other than that, it has a very manageable psychological sort of profile of side effects. And so that's one that I like as an alternative to something hormonal. The hormonal IUD also has a lot of these same effects that we've been talking about.
What would be the point of taking an IUD with hormones if you could take one without hormones and get the same effect?
I know. No, amen.
So
I have no
ridiculous.
idea. Yeah, no, I have no idea. And so some people might say, well, you can avoid copper toxicity because it does create an inflammatory experience like down in your cervix to have that there. But it really is minor. In most women, it's not anything to worry about. And they've done a lot of safety tests on it. And I think that there's a lot of myth around the idea of copper toxicity with that. And
I've had one my
that's
whole
not-
life.
Yeah,
Like
no,
20 years. Or,
yeah,
no,
no,
I
they're-
changed it, but like every
Yeah.
10 years you change it.
Yeah, no, they're great. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, no, that's definitely my favorite because it does allow you to cycle
Yeah.
and experience your normal, state of your amplitude of being. Whereas with the hormonal IUD, it's like, most women who are on it, and there's a few funky things about it. So one is that most women who are on it, when they're first on it for like the first year or so,
The copper one?
no, this is the hormonal
Oh, the
one.
hormonal one. Okay.
Yeah, it's like the women don't ovulate, right? And so it's like the hormones are released to such an extent that they're telling the brain not to ovulate.
Okay.
And so doctors will tell women like, oh, it's, locally acting hormones, which is bullshit because there's no such thing as a locally acting hormone.
Yeah.
Hormones go into the bloodstream and they go everywhere that blood travels. And the last I checked, that's everywhere.
Right.
And that includes the brain.
Yes.
And so like the idea that like somehow they managed to just circulate down there is like the biggest bunch of crap. And then
People
doctors
will do anything and say anything
well, I know it is
to
like,
sell stuff or to like.
it's so frustrating because a lot of, I've talked to so many women who've had the experience of feeling like they're totally crazy because their doctor is like, well, I've been so depressed since I started this and, and unable to even get out of bed because of my depression. And I feel like it was this IUD, but the doctor said the hormones act locally. And I'm like, that's like malpractice. I mean,
Totally,
it's
right?
just crazy. I'm like, there's no such thing as a locally acting hormone. And so, most women aren't ovulating and when they're on it, but then a lot of them about halfway through the 5 years that they're on it, a lot of them will start ovulating. So then the hormones are in there, but they're not, the brain is like up to, there's kind of figured out what's going on. And so because the levels are low, they keep it very low. And so the brain is like, all right, these levels aren't very high, and ultimately will start stimulating the ovaries to ovulate again. But the question I've always had is if you are able to protect yourself from pregnancy with the hormonal IUD without suppressing ovulation, so right, so not turning that off, why do you need the hormones in there at all?
That's what I just said. Like, it makes no
Yeah.
sense. Like,
Well,
why,
no, I
who in the
know.
hell would get an IUD that has hormones? I never
What?
understood that. Like, the
No,
whole purpose of getting an IUD,
I
so you
know.
don't need
Well,
hormones.
so I've heard people get the hormone one because it's plastic, and they're like, "Oh, I don't want the metal in my body." Okay, fine. But this plastic one clearly doesn't need the damn hormones, or else,
Exactly. Well,
and
that's the
so
thing.
like,
It's basically like, it isn't just like covering your
well, it's
cervix
not really covering it, but it is putting something there.
there, so
And
you're
so
not.
your body is like, "No, thank you. I'm not getting pregnant."
That's what
And
I mean.
so,
It's like
yeah.
it's basically like a shield or
Yeah.
whatever you call it.
Right, yeah. It's like
Okay, but what I wanted to ask you, because it sounds like, how about pheromones? Where does pheromones fit into this?
so pheromones are essentially like anytime they have a chemical signal that's affecting another organism, right?
Okay.
So if you smell my estrogen levels, then we call that a pheromone if that
Okay.
influences your behavior. And so with a naturally cycling woman, you do get these kinds of pheromonal effects, as I've noted, since men, when they smell the scent of ovulating women, it tends to increase their testosterone levels. So men actually get a little increase in testosterone in response to the scent of ovulation. And without knowing what it is, right? They'll like smell t-shirts worn by women who are ovulating, and they prefer the scent of the ovulating women compared to t-shirts worn by the same women at different phases in the cycle when estrogen is low. And so, yes, so having like taking the
Wow.
pill, for example, can disrupt this, right? It can prevent, because women aren't in this nice estrogenic state at any
Right.
point in their cycle. That's going to decrease some of these attraction related molecules that women might already release otherwise. And it also seems to decrease women's ability to pick up on male pheromonal cues, right? So we know from research that especially at high fertility, when estrogen is high, women are really good at being able to detect metabolites of of testosterone. So when men's bodies are breaking down testosterone, it releases different types of compounds that shed in the skin, and women are really good at being able to pick up on it when estrogen is high. Their brain is like, like I smell a man, right? And
Really?
yes, and like are really, it's like it's attracting to them, right? They're drawn to it. They like that. And for women who are using the pill, no,
They don't
it's
know.
like
It's like they just, everything is shut
it's just
off.
blunted. Yeah, it's just blunted. It's that blindfold from like we've been talking about from that show, Love is
Love
Blind.
is blind.
Yeah.
So then women, though, who are not on birth control, they typically, like, what is attractive to a woman naturally, and what is attractive to a man naturally?
Okay. Yeah, and obviously when I answer this question, it's going to have huge error bars around it because there's so much idiosyncrasy in everybody's partner
Yes, of
choice.
course.
But just, like there are some things that men and women tend to desire sort of in equal measures. And so like men and women both want a partner who's, kind and understanding, and a partner who's in good health. And these are things that men and women are both looking for. In ways that men and women on average tend to differ in terms of their partner choice. A naturally cycling woman likes to strike a balance between what in the evolutionary sciences we would call direct and indirect benefits. Direct benefits are all of those things that you get yourself from your partner. So, for example, if they are a good provider, that would be, a good direct benefit. And that's one that we know that women desire in their partners. We also know that women are interested in a long-term mating context with partners who exhibit cues related to being a good dad, right? So somebody who's going to be caring and be able to help care for children. And so those are direct benefits. Anything a woman gets herself. Indirect benefits are essentially good genes, right? So this is where we're looking for qualities that are related to genetic quality in a partner that we want for our children. And obviously this usually goes on unconsciously, right? These tend to be the qualities that our brain just happens to find really sexy, right? So something like having testosterone related cues. So we like men who have a nice chiseled jaw, right? Broad shoulders, deep voice, a dominant sort of assertive personality. These are cues related to testosterone. And testosterone is what we call a good genes marker, simply because men who were able to release high levels of testosterone during development, that indicates that they probably had a high quality immune system, because men's immune systems get traded off with testosterone in a way that men's bodies will not produce high levels of testosterone if they have an immune emergency to deal with. And so the idea here is that only men who are in good health during development are able to release really high levels of testosterone during development, because there is this trade-off between immune system functioning and testosterone levels, right? And so one of the reasons that our brain finds testosterone-related cues sexy in men is because only men who had relatively high functioning immune systems during development were able to release that and form those types of features. And so,
Wow.
so that's like one type of a cue. The scent of genetic compatibility, that's another set of sort of genes that we're looking for. And we tend to pick this up by way of scent, right? Sort of picking up on some of those cues that somebody might have different immune genes than your own, which are generally the ones that we find most attractive. And for most naturally cycling women, what you see is that when we're choosing a partner, it's generally brokering that trade-off. It's like sort of understanding you want the sexy qualities that are going to, just like really attract you and make you, physically drawn to somebody. But then also as a long-term partner, somebody who's going to be, sort of a good provider and be a good parent and so on and so forth. And, so for a naturally cycling woman, what you generally see is that there is some sort of trade-off, right? Where they're making decisions about, this person has to be somebody I'm attracted to, but also has to have these other qualities. And then you find the person who best, matches that set of criteria. For women who are using the pill, it seems like all of that, what we call indirect benefits, that genetic compatibility and cues of, immune system quality because of testosterone and all that, it seems like all of that just gets shut down. It's just like the light switch goes off.
Just goes
And
off.
it's focusing exclusively on these other partnership qualities, which again, isn't necessarily bad, right? It's just different. It's going to get you a different partner probably than what you would get if you were striking that balance between what, who you're most physically attracted to, and then, who's going to be a good partner and, good at provisioning. And so that's, men tend to be, in a sort of natural state of things. Men are also brokering that same balance, but for men, there's a whole lot of emphasis placed on cues related to fertility and what we call reproductive value. And fertility, of course, refers to the probability that a woman will be able to have a child with an active sex. And we know that for women, fertility peaks at the very young age of about 25 and then starts to decline. And of course, it declines pretty rapidly after a woman's in her late 30s, mid to late 30s. And men, of course, are dialed into cues that have historically been related to fertility because, again, over the course of evolutionary time, those men who just so happened to find women most beautiful when they were able to reproduce, they would have passed down that preference to a lot of sons, right? Whereas if you have a man whose preference tended to focus on qualities related to older age, they wouldn't have passed down that preference to anybody, right? Because
But that doesn't seem to be like, I think, are there very specific things that you can point to that men find attractive beyond just cues of estrogen cycles?
Right. No.
In
No, I'm just
evolution.
kidding. I'm just kidding. Absolutely not. That's the only thing that matters.
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. No, there are so many things. I mean, men's partner choices are just as complex as ours in a lot of ways. And what you tend to see is that if men are just choosing like a short-term sexual partner, then it's like looks and all the superficial stuff.
Yeah.
But when men are choosing a long-term partner, in addition to the cues related to fertility, but and let me just make sure that really is important to men's attraction. I mean, whether we like it or not,
Right.
it's like,
It's youth also.
it's huge. Yeah,
Yeah.
youth and because
Youth.
youth is related to fertility.
Yeah, exactly. That's what
It's
I'm saying.
confounded. Yeah, and so those things tend to play a really important role. But men are also like some of the things that they're most important, that they find most important. Like when you ask men to rank order, like how important are all these qualities? Loyalty, kindness. Right. So some of these, other
I
types
think
of
that's a load of
qualities.
shit, to be honest. I
Yeah.
think if they're not attracted to you,
Oh yeah. No, absolutely.
I
100%.
think after
Right.
that, then it's loyalty, guys.
Right.
Because I have a
Right.
lot of guy friends who are in their let's say in their midlife, like 40s, let's say. Even some of them are 50s, never been married, never have a serious girlfriend. And I try to set them up all the time.
Yeah.
And I say to them, oh, I have the best girl. She's this, she's pretty, she's successful, she's got a great personality. At the end of the day, they're not interested. Why?
Right.
Unless they find her hot
Right.
physically.
Right.
All those other qualities, her success doesn't matter, her confidence doesn't matter, her sense of humor doesn't matter. I think that with men, I'm no evolutionary psychologist, but I would
Right.
say physical attractiveness is pretty much paramount.
I would completely agree with that. No, I think that it is. But in a lot of ways, I mean, it's for us, for women, and
Not for
in
women,
particular, well, no, so yes and no. So no, I don't think that looks are paramount for women, but I will say that for women, because for us, what attraction is a lot more complex than for men. Attraction for men is generally physical attraction, right, based on physical cues. Women's attraction is a lot more complicated, right? Just meaning that it's like for us, physical attraction, in addition to just being based on somebody's physical appearance, is also based on all kinds of things. Like, does this person have, a take charge personality? Does this person, say the right things? Is this person going to be a good provider? And some of these other cues, I mean, it's like women are the ones who get the ick for a reason. It's like the ick is essentially like somebody just violated something that impacts our very complex and nuanced version of attraction, which is about more than just physical appearance. But for us, attraction is just as important as it is for men. It's just that what feeds into attraction for women is more complicated than just physical appearance.
Okay, that makes sense to me. That makes sense to me. But then why is there such a mating crisis? Like people are not dating anymore
Right.
they're not having relationships anymore.
Right. Yeah. And that's such an important question because it's like, what is going to happen societally?
Yeah.
I mean, honestly. I think that I think the answer is very complicated. I don't know that I know all the answers. I think that one of the answers is just simply that we have the ability to regulate our fertility now with birth control. And for most of history, we did not have that ability. And the fact is, there are a lot of people who now are saying, I don't want to have kids and I don't have to have kids, right? And it used to be the case that was never a possibility, right? It's like if you liked sex, you were going to be a mother, like whether you wanted them or not.
Right.
It's like whether you want, like the idea of like whether you want kids used to not be a question people could ask. It was about whether or not you wanted to have sex.
Right.
And so I think, that like that's one thing, but like, why are people not wanting to have sex? I think that there's a few things happening. One is that I think hormone or endocrine disruptors have lowered testosterone to an extent that it's making people, just less sexually motivated. We know that testosterone is one of the big sexually motivating hormones, and that higher levels are related to more sexual desire, lower levels are linked with less sexual desire. So that's one thing, is that we have these endocrine disrupting compounds that are lowering testosterone, and I think that's a part of the puzzle. Another part of the puzzle is hormonal birth control, and we know that hormonal birth control is something that's associated with lower libido, right? So it can really kill women's sexual desire and in a pretty significant way. And so women are feeling less sexually motivated, and they're feeling less sexually motivated in part because of the endocrine disruptors, because their testosterone also is being lowered. And then birth control can lower sexual desire further. So I think that's also part of the picture. I think another part of the picture is that now, we have internet porn available everywhere. And I think that men are like, why should I bother to do all of this work and have to jump through all of these hoops for somebody who's less hot than the person that I see on the computer screen? And so I think that men are like not feeling as motivated to do the types of things that they used to have to do in order to get access to sex,
Right.
by, just by sort of using a cheap alternative. And so I think that's also part of the picture. Another part of the picture is that birth control has allowed women to achieve more than they've ever achieved in their entire lives, right? In our entire history, as a species. I mean, women are dominating. I mean, it's like we're getting more college degrees, we're getting more advanced degrees, we're going to law school and medical school at a greater extent than men. And women are hypergamous, meaning that they like to mate up. So they like to be involved in relationships with men who have at least as much education as they have themselves. So women are now in this position where they're looking up to find partners who have the same levels, at least, of education and career success that they have themselves. And there's just not a lot of men there. Because, women are doing really well. Men are kind of like, I don't really, I can just look at porn and then I don't have to do all this work and get all these degrees and jump through all these hoops in order to get sexual access, because my brain is being tricked into believing I'm getting sexual access by looking at pornography. And then the last one, I think, is online dating. And I think that what that has created is made it really easy to find partners. And for men who are doing well, so men in this climate, like who have those really good jobs and have the types of qualities that women are looking for partners, they are now entering the marriage market from the dating market a lot later than they used to. And so what happens is, because men are able to get access to dates, just like it's so easy, it's so easy to find a date
Yeah.
when you have a dating app. And so they're not settling down until they're like 40, or like
Even 50.
you're 50.
50 is now the new 40.
Yeah, that's what they say.
That's what
right?
they
That's
say.
what they say. That's
Yeah.
That's what the men are trying to tell us.
Yes.
And so you'll have men who are hanging out in the dating market for a really long time, and then you have women who go into you have women who go into the marriage market from the dating market earlier, where they're like ready to settle down because their fertility is going to decline. And so women then are up here in the marriage market, right? There's not a lot of men around because they're mostly hanging out in the dating market. And then the women are also looking for people who are at least as educated as themselves. And I mean, it's really causing problems.
Well, yeah, and also from the way you described it, what that would tell me is if men are getting married later, right? Because they don't have to get married as early. They have this dating app so they can date, and and what they're attracted to is more youthful estrogen cycles. They're going to end up dating younger girls.
Yep.
So the young girls are going to get married to these older men, because for girls, men who are older can come across as sexy, not
Right.
old.
Right. Yeah.
But for girls, older women look like older women.
Right. Yeah. It's like our brain, it's so interesting because go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say, and then what happens is it's leaving these women who have now who've had a lot of success, financially, in business, professionally. They're leaving them in the lurch because now there's nowhere for them to go further, right?
Right.
And well, my question is then, is why don't those women just go out with a younger guy who's just hot and just do what men used to do for all these years,
Right.
right? Like just do what men do.
Right.
They're successful men. They want a younger girl, so then they end up with these girls. Why don't women do that?
Right. Well, and I think that there are some women
It's
doing
starting
that.
more.
Right. And so I've got two answers to that. So one is that I think that women are starting to do that more. Right. So we see like,
But they're not having kids with them.
No, they're not having kids with them, right?
They're
So
not having families with
like
them.
we're sort of seeing like the rise of the cougar, right? Where you'll see older women dating and they're just, they're not serious boyfriends. They're just like
Playthings.
playthings, because the women are like, I have my own
Fuckboys.
money. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like I've got my own money. I don't need a man for that. I just want to have fun on my own terms. And so then they just like take a hot guy that they can parade around and have a good time with. And Godspeed. Men have been doing this forever. It's about time.
100%. But
And
it's disrupting the natural flow of evolution and
right.
Darwinism. I would say, like,
Right.
well, isn't it survival of the fittest is all
Well,
about.
and it's just really about whatever traits get passed down or the traits that you're going to see, right? And so all that means is that, the tendency for older women or for older women to date younger men, they're not passing that preference down to anybody,
Right,
because they're
right,
not
right.
having any more offspring. But and the men aren't passing that tendency to want to mate with older women on to anybody either, because there's no
Right.
reproduction going on in that context. And so, like, I don't think that it's really disrupting anything, just because then nothing is
Nothing's
really
happening.
changing. Yeah, exactly. Nothing's really changing. But I think that there's not as much of that as there is for men, because we spend most of our evolutionary history in in a context, as living as hunter gatherers, and women were very dependent on men for access to resources, and so, like, getting access to food and protection, particularly during pregnancy. And because of that, we've inherited the psychology that tends to be more coy, right? So we tend to be more sexually cautious relative to men, and we tend to be more oriented toward long-term mating relative to men, just simply because throughout most of our evolutionary history, there was no short term. I mean, like, if you're a woman engaged in like short term mating, you could end
Right.
up with a baby. And so even if you're choosing somebody as just a casual fling, there's this tendency for women to get emotionally enmeshed in those relationships because we're wired that way.
Right. We're wired differently.
Yeah, we're just wired differently. It's like we faced different adaptive problems throughout our history due to the fact that we're the ones who get pregnant, right? And because of
Right.
that, the costs of short-term sex and just being sort of casual willy-nilly are much greater than what they are for men. And so that's led to a divergence within our sexual psychology that tends to make men more oriented toward, casual encounters without really, developing any sort of strings attached. Whereas for women, it tends to be a little bit more complicated.
Are men attracted to successful women, confident women, established women?
Yes, but in as much as they're attracted to them first, right? Like, as you were talking about, like, I don't think that any level of professional success can make up for if a man doesn't feel that a woman is physically attractive. And what that can mean, though, is very broad, because that doesn't mean, obviously, there's a lot of people that I think objectively we could say, like, this person is not the most attractive person we've ever seen in their life, and somebody's in love with them and thinks that they're beautiful, so it's like we have to, sort of also take that with a grain of salt, sort of understanding the fact that for the most part, there can be somebody for everyone.
Right. My mother would always say there's a lid to every pot.
I
Right.
love that. That's like beautiful. That's perfect.
That's right.
Yeah.
I heard you say somewhere, I don't remember where, that looks is the number one predictor for women's upward mobility.
Yeah. Yeah. How's that for a depressing statistic?
Right?
Yeah. They did a study where they were looking at different types of predictors for being able to transcend the social class in which you were born. And, in this great meritocratic society that we live in, we would like to think that it would be something like your educational attainment or, where you went to school or what you majored in, right? It might be something like this. But instead, what the research found is that the strongest predictor for women for upward social mobility was their physical attractiveness, and that this played a greater role in their ability to transcend their social class of origin than their family's existing socioeconomic status, their education level, and their career choice.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty depressing.
Isn't that depressing?
It is.
What's a man's number one predictor for upward mobility?
Oh, that's a really great question. I don't know, but I am willing to bet that it is probably either educate. I think it is some combination of like education that they get and then like their career choice is my guess.
Right. Totally different, right?
Yeah, totally different set of, no, it's not his physical attractiveness. I'll
It's
tell you that
definitely
much.
not.
No.
Exactly. Do you know the other saying, like, if a man wants to be attractive, he stands on his wallet? That's the other thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I've heard that.
But the truth is, I hate to say it, but there's a reason why some of these things, there's a lot of truth in these things, right?
Yes.
Like, that's why you see a lot of women I see with men who are like, you wouldn't call them attractive by looking at them. They're 4'3", bald, and not that physically attractive,
Yeah.
but I tell you, when they have like $100 million in their bank account, they're very attractive dating the supermodel.
Yeah, no,
Right?
it's really funny because we did this really cool study where we had men who were kind of average looking. We had them photographed like looking like they were in a couple with women of varying levels of attractiveness. And what do you think? As soon as women see kind of an average, kind of guy with a really beautiful woman, what do they think?
He's rich.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course.
And so what we did is we asked people about like different qualities, that these men had, and just based on the virtue of the attractiveness of the women that men are pictured with, women infer all of these different things about like what they're like, and including the fact that yes, if you see a man with a beautiful woman who's like far more beautiful than he is handsome, there's this general assumption that we tend to assume that he's like financially very well off and probably kind of got some other positive qualities as well. But it's really funny.
And it's funny because the second you think of that, you think about the female, and you think if the girl's really beautiful, you think, oh, well, she's a gold digger, or all the
Right.
other connotations, which then, like, because of the survival of the fittest and all that, is there a lot of jealousy with women because there's only a certain amount of, like, of that stuff we're talking about? There is a limited amount of great guys
Yes.
that we
Yeah.
all want. Like, I've done a few podcasts on this where just in terms of just on the dating apps, right?
Yeah.
It's like 1% of the men get 99% of the action, right?
Yeah.
Because women want who are 6 foot, make over 100,000, all these things,
Yeah,
let's just say,
yeah.
where it doesn't leave a very big amount of a lot of men.
Right.
But there's a lot of women out there.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And women are naturally catty.
Yes.
Right?
I think that there's an element of that that's very true. Yes.
Yes. An element or more than one an
yes,
element?
Yes, multiple elements. Yeah. So, with any resource that's desirable, there's only so many, right?
Right.
Or else it wouldn't be desirable.
Supply, yeah.
Right? Supply and demand. It's like there's only so many houses on the water,
Yes.
there's only so many attractive mates. There's only so many top positions in the job.
Yeah.
And so there's always going to be an element of competition. And for women, especially when we're talking about mate related things, one of the primary areas in which they compete is attractiveness. And so here you have women who kind of size each other up, right? And then they can be really terrible to one another when they're trying to compete in the same pool. And I mean, I remember when I was in my 20s and how much of that there would be, this like rivalry and that sort of thing. And then like once I was married and had children, like it allowed me to have friendships with women in ways that I hadn't been able to have,
Right.
when I was in my 20s, because I think that like that people were paired off kind of took the pressure
They
off of all
didn't
of that.
find you to be a threat.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Because you were taken, you were already like,
Right.
you were dormant in their way. Like you were kind
Right.
of like, your things were suppressed, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, no, it's really interesting because I've also I've been divorced and now I'm married again.
Okay.
And during that period when I was divorced, I mean, talk about a polarizing event
Tell
in
me.
people's lives. Well, I mean, when you are a person who is with a bunch of married people, right? You live in a community of married people who you spend a lot of time with, and then all of a sudden, you're not a married person. You become very much a threat to
Did they ostracize
everybody.
you?
Yeah, there was a lot of that happened. I kind of got shoved out. I got a little bit of the exit stage left.
So then what happened then?
Well, so what happened? I found my new community. I mean,
Was your new community all single women?
yeah, it was mostly single women, and and it was a totally, and it was a really freeing, experience to go through that. It was terrible to lose. I lost some people that I thought were really
Friends.
good friends, but I think that it's like on the one hand I understood it.
Yeah. If anyone would, it would be you.
Yeah, well, exactly. And so it's like, I didn't, at first I was hurt and angry. And then afterwards I had a little bit of reflection on it. And it's like, I mean, there's two things going on there. It's like, one, you don't want to have this single person that's a threat. But it's also a threat to, I mean, marriage is kind of held together by bubble gum and shoelaces. You know what I mean? It's like it's a hard thing to do, it's like really hard to
Yes.
do and so the idea that somebody can just like walk away from it and be okay, because I like walked away and and my ex-husband and I, and in some ways it's even more threatening. He and I are great, and like we're great co-parents, and we do Thanksgivings together, and
I love
we
that.
call it the web of love. And because
How long
like
were you
the
married
kids,
for?
like 17 years, so I was married a long time, and
And how
like
old were the kids when you got the divorce?
I want to say 12 and 9.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
so yeah, and it like yeah, so to have somebody who I walk away from a marriage and I'm okay and financially I'm fine because I'm taking care of my business, and then to be able to get along well with my ex-husband, and I feel like that also feels threatening to marriage. Do you know what I mean?
Really? Why?
Because marriage is hard and horrible sometimes, and
Yes.
and being somebody who's married again. It's like, and we talk about this. My husband was also formerly married,
Hmm.
and it's like really hard to be married. I mean, it's like sometimes you're just like, this is terrible. Like this is a really terrible thing, but you persevere. And the idea of like, when you're having one of those moments of marriage being terrible, to see people walking away from it and being just fine. I mean, that feels really threatening. Like, oh my gosh, should I be like that might be and that is like, you don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Nobody wants to have to sit and think about whether their marriage is a good idea or a bad idea. I mean,
You,
it's like it's a really scary thing. It was a hard thing.
I think also it makes people like think to themselves like they're jealous a little bit. Like I wish
Right.
I could do that. Why can't
Right.
I do
Right.
that? Like will
Right.
I be okay?
Yeah.
Or they feel trapped because financially they're trapped.
Right.
Like there's all
Yes.
these other them issues
Yes.
that
Yes.
you are basically you're basically making them have to you're forcing them to look
Right.
at.
Well, right. And I think that was like, I think that's the biggest. I think you just hit the nail on the head. I mean, honestly, it's like how many people are in my ex-husband and I had a pretty lovely relationship for the most part. We just kind of grew in different
Yeah.
directions.
Yeah.
And so like there's a lot of people who are in marriages a lot worse than ours was.
Yeah.
And then, and then
Then you're the one who got
and
the
I'm the one who
divorce.
got, yes. And so I think that there was a lot of that too. So like I said, studying what I study, I have a lot of compassion for how everybody responded to me. And it was really hurtful at first, but I do feel compassion and I understand why that happened.
Right.
And then I was able to find my new community.
And so when you're now in the new community
Uh-huh.
and you guys are all single, like you were saying, was there cattiness and jealousy because you're all in the same boat and look like, oh, she's going on a date. Why can't I
Right,
go on a date? Was
right.
there any of that?
No, what's really interesting is no, and so with my really tight group of girlfriends, no, and we actually would trade notes. Like we had a spreadsheet when we were dating.
Really?
Yes, where it was like to make sure, like, did you go out? And it's like, oh wait, I know I went out with him. No, he's great for you. And so like we would
That's
even like
great.
set people up on the side, like on side chat with people that we would go out with, and then but they didn't match up on the app or whatever with the other person.
I love that because you
Yeah.
know what? You're meeting these people and it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe they're not right for you, but you have Sally out there who you'd be
Yes.
great for.
Yes, and in fact, one of our pictures that we had was all three of us together. Like, because there was three of us that spent most of it. There was five of us, but there's three of us that were actively dating. And so we had a picture of all three of us, and then it was like, if it doesn't work out with one of us, you can have the other two.
That's, I love that.
It's like a threefer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that there's something about, because we were all in our, we were all in our early 40s, or late 30s, early 40s when we met. And I think that there's also something where as you get older, in addition to, just like whether you're partnered or not, it's like, I think there's really a time that you can appreciate just how amazing female friendship is that I don't think you get when you're in your 20s.
Yeah, I think you're right because I think there's a different like, your priorities change. You soften up a little bit.
Yeah.
There's other things that happen. How long have you been married to this new husband?
Oh my God. Well, we've been together for 3 years. We're just recently married. Yeah.
Oh, congratulations!
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
And so he's got kids too.
Yes, he does. Yeah. So we've got a blended family of 5 kids.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, and I say thankfully, but no, really, they're all wonderful. They're older. I mean, so
No,
like
that's
the
thankfully.
oldest is about to graduate college.
Yeah.
The second oldest is a freshman in college, and then our youngest are both freshmen in high school. So it's not like we have all of these like so much chaos going on in our
Right,
house.
right, right.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because you've like lived all these different like just different
Yes.
stages of life
Yes.
that you can talk on. So then
Yes.
you were on the apps.
Yeah, I was.
So how did you find the apps?
So I found the app. So it's funny because my first exposure to the apps was when I was in graduate school at UT Austin way back in the day. I was like 2001. And I was actually writing a research paper on mate preferences. And it was before there were apps, but it was like when like Match.com was a thing and it was like a website. And so I remember going there and like, I was like, doing this project looking at what are some of the qualities that men compared to women say that they're looking for in partners. And then like did a quantification, and lo and behold, men were more likely to say they were looking for looks and women were more likely to say they were looking for financial stability or some version of that. And so that was like my very first exposure. And then, and I was dating what ended up being my husband during that. So I wasn't like on the app, on
Right.
that. But then, I had, because of the work that I do, I mean, I'm very familiar with what everybody is doing with the apps forever,
Yeah.
and sort of monitoring that because it's like something that I've been really interested in, understanding relationships and sex and dating dynamics. And so looking at the apps, I mean, I wasn't like looking at the apps when I was married, but just having awareness of them and like what they were and what people were doing
Yes, yes,
was something
yes.
that I'd
It
always
was
had.
research.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
totally. It was like I had my
Yeah.
finger on the pulse of it. And then when I got divorced, and then when it was like, I don't even, I'm trying to remember how I found out like what all the kids were using. You know
Yeah,
what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah.
And I think that I feel like I read something. Like, how wonky is this? I think I read it in like the Wall Street Journal, like what people were using, which
Yeah,
is
yeah,
like,
yeah.
and I think that that's how I found like Bumble.
Is that what you
And
used?
that's what I was on. And then Hinge for a little bit. But then, yeah, and then I ended up dating the person. I mean, I dated a few different guys, but then I ended up in the relationship with my now husband, and so then it's all she wrote.
The rest is
The rest
history.
is
Are you
history. Yes,
happy
is
now?
there. Yes, I'm very happy.
Okay. Are you happy you went through the divorce?
Yeah, I don't, it's hard to say that, right? So yes, it was the right decision. Do I hate it for my kids? Like, would I prefer for them not to have to visit both of us? Yeah, I would prefer that. I will say that I think that of anybody that I know who's in a divorced relationship, I think mine is incredibly healthy. And like I said, like my ex and I, like he came over for Christmas to my husband's
That's
house. And I mean,
great.
it's just like, this is the way that we do things. And everybody's cool with it. And I feel like my kids get the experience of being able to see that their parents still love and care for each other, even though they're not married. And so that's like, I guess on the positive side, but, and I can also tell myself, like, I think it's better for my kids to see me flourishing and not feeling, like
Yeah.
I'm in a bad spot. And like I said, we didn't fight or anything. I just wasn't happy. And I think, and it showed, and I was at working all the time. So I didn't want to be, that was not good. And so, yeah, I guess the answer is that yes, it was the right decision. But it's hard to say like yes about something because of course it hurt my kids and that was hard.
Yeah. I mean, even if the most amicable divorce is still a
Yeah,
divorce with the kid for the kids, right?
exactly.
They're gonna have to go back and
Exactly.
forth to the homes.
Yes, exactly. And that's what they do. And would they prefer not to do that? Yes, they would. They would prefer if we were still together.
Right, right.
But that being said, they're also like, they're learning some resilience with all of this. And like I said, I think that of anybody I know who's got a divorce set up, I think ours is really a nice one. And I think that the kids have been able to learn a lot from it.
Good answer.
Thanks.
You're welcome. I think I got sidetracked there because I was so interested in your life.
It's like, yeah, let's
Yeah.
just talk about my life.
Yeah, let's talk about life. Well, I know that at the beginning I asked you a question and I think that we kind of like didn't finish it, which was all the things that when you're on birth control, what it changes. Hold on, I think I wrote it here. Well, it's like the 5 things that birth control can change or how
Yeah.
it's not just your parental, it's not just your partner choice, but there's other things too it does.
Yes.
And that's the
Yeah.
part that I didn't
Okay.
finish with. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Do you want me to start it off?
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that birth control does, besides just influencing potentially partner choice. We also know from research that it affects sexual desire, which I think I alluded
Yeah,
to.
we
It's
talked
like
about
it
that
really
one.
can put women on sexual lockdown in a lot of cases. It increases the risk of developing depression or anxiety. And this is particularly true for younger women. So they've done studies where they look at the risk of developing major depressive disorder based on whether or not you're using hormonal birth control or not. And what you tend to see is that the risk is increased for everybody of developing one of those types of outcomes from using hormonal birth control, but it's especially great for young women. So women 19 and younger whose brains are still developing, the risk of developing a major depressive disorder and the risk of suicide risk attempt and successful suicide attempt are significantly greater for teens who use hormonal birth control compared to those who do not. There's also now research showing that if you're using hormonal birth control during your teen years, so again, 19 and younger, that this is associated with a greater risk of developing major depressive disorder across your lifetime, even after you go off the birth control pill. Because it seems that it's probably influencing brain development. And so the important message here with depression and anxiety is one, if you go on hormonal birth control, keep an eye on yourself. Have somebody that you love keep an eye on you. Because the fact is, when we're depressed or anxious, our brain doesn't say, like, gosh, I'm depressed or anxious, and I bet it's my drugs. Instead, what happens is we think, like, God, my life sucks right now. Like, my boss hates me, my boyfriend hates me. Like, it's like we feel like all of these things are happening and we feel bad. We
Right.
don't actually think, gosh, I'm depressed. Right. And so
Right.
it's good to
We
have
don't
somebody.
acknowledge what's really
Yeah, no,
happening.
it's like our brain has no idea. It just
Right.
makes up stories about what's going on. And so having somebody know that you're going on it so they can keep an eye on you is incredibly important because then they can tell you if you're having a personality change, if you seem low, if you seem off, right? These are things that can tell you that your birth control might not be working for you in that way. And this is particularly true, as I said, for these young girls. I think that it's smart to avoid going on hormonal birth control if at all possible until you're 20 or older, just because your brain is going to have most of its development done at that time, which means that it won't have a long-term lasting impact on you. But if you are going to go on it when you're younger than 20, really, really take care and make sure that somebody's keeping an eye on you just because the risk of developing a mental health related side effect is so high and pronounced in this group. So that's another thing that hormonal birth control can do. Another thing that surprises people is that it can actually decrease your ability to put on muscle mass from weight training. And this happens because it keeps your testosterone levels low. And testosterone plays an important role in terms of prompting the biological cascade that allows you to put on lean muscle mass. And so women who are doing weight training, doing the exact same regimen compared to women who are naturally cycling, they put on significantly less lean muscle mass compared to their naturally cycling counterparts, which is surprising to a lot of people.
Well, you know what? It's not that surprising to me because they do say that there's weight gain with being on the pill. And a lot of people don't want to go on the pill. I was one of them at a very young age because I was scared of gaining weight. So
Yeah,
that makes
yeah.
sense to me because your testosterone will be suppressed. You won't be the less lean muscle mass you have, the less calories you're going to burn. Therefore, you won't be
Yeah.
burning as much.
Yeah, no, for
Right.
sure. Yeah, no, for
That makes
sure.
sense to me.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And then it also can influence your ability to regulate stress. And this is another one that's really surprising to people. And that is that when you go on hormonal birth control, there's research that finds that it decreases your body's ability to respond in a dynamic way to stress, potentially
Wow.
leaving you less able to be able to regulate your emotional responses to things and also being less able to cope from and learn from stress. And so there's research that shows, for example, that women who use hormonal birth control, that rather than having a big spike in cortisol that all of us get when we're feeling stressed out, which a lot of people, give a bad rap. Cortisol gets kind of a bad rap because it's, if you have it chronic exposure to cortisol, it's not good. But having big bursts of cortisol when we're stressed out is actually very adaptive. And it's like part of how our body helps to manage stress and cope with stress. And so, like when cortisol gets released, it dumps fat and sugar into the bloodstream so we can make a quick getaway. It primes the birth of new neurons in our hippocampus, which is the brain area that helps us learn and remember things. And so it gets us ready to be able to recover from stress, to be able to learn from stress, and to be able to sort of move on with our lives. And research finds that women who are using hormonal birth control, that rather than having this nice big response of cortisol in response to stress, they have a really flat, blunted response to cortisol in response to stress. And this is something that we only tend to see in people who've suffered from PTSD or things like exposure to childhood trauma. They have these blunted cortisol types of responses. And you also see this in women who are using hormonal birth control. And it suggests that it has some sort of dysregulatory pattern within the stress response. And, nobody knows exactly what it is. But what researchers think is going on is that the synthetic progesterone in birth control pills, which is called a progestin, it doesn't perfectly match the progesterone receptor, which is the receptor in the cell that picks up the hormone. And it also gets picked up by other things, including sometimes testosterone and including sometimes cortisol. And so what researchers think goes on is that these molecules are stimulating cortisol receptors and making the brain think that it's in a state of chronic stress, like chronic uncontrollable stress, and that's causing the stress response to shut down, which isn't good. It's not good for anybody. It's bad for emotional regulation. It's bad for mental health. And like I said, it's something that we tend to see in people who have PTSD. And so not something that's positive for women who are using hormonal birth control.
Wow. So as an adolescent, if you're listening or parents listening, what is an alternative just besides doing what we talked about earlier?
Copper IUD.
Yeah, besides doing the copper IUD, that's the best alternative.
I mean, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, doing something, especially with a teenager that's non-hormonal, is going to be the way to go.
Yeah.
Copper IUD is a good one. I don't recommend the fertility awareness method for teenagers because, just the idea of tracking your cycles and only using condom, like the idea of a teenager trying to do that effectively, it just gives me chills. I can just imagine. So, I mean, we just aren't left with a lot of options. And so one of the big messages from, that I've wanted to really communicate with my book is not like, oh, the birth control pill is evil and all this. Instead, it's, we need more options. This is imperfect. This is imperfect and we need to have more choices because the fact is, especially for young girls whose brains are developing and are very sensitive to hormones, we don't have a lot of good options.
No, I mean, at all. But the thing that's probably why also you wanted to write this book, I saw, right? Because you had your own story. Once you got off of birth control, you were a different person. You were making playlists and you were
I was like, I felt alive and I felt sexy and it was just it was like an awakening in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, I find that so you don't, that's why I love this conversation with you because I never really spoke about the correlation between, we talk a lot about HRT on here, right? Hormone replacement therapy when you're older, right? Yeah. But we don't talk about the hormones that we are putting in our bodies at a younger age to suppress, right? Or we only talk about the opposite.
Right. Yeah. And it's really interesting because, people tend to assume that hormone therapy, you must be anti-hormone therapy and I'm like, no, I think hormones are great. I think that the problem, that with the birth control pill is that you're not getting exposure to hormones.
They're suppressing your hormones.
Yeah, you're suppressing them.
Right.
Hormones are wonderful. They're a wonderful thing.
It's a different thing, right? You're either at a young age or because of for birth control, you're suppressing them. But at an older age, you're trying to increase them to balance yourself out.
Right. Yeah.
So you don't really do any work on that, right? On the studies of
No, I mean, I definitely have awareness of this space. I know about the research in the space, and I can say that, there's a lot of women who are being given birth control pills as a way to ease the menopausal transition, instead of being given micronized progesterone and estrogen. Yeah. And which I think is terrible. Just because the synthetic progesterone in birth control pills, that progestin, isn't biologically identical to progesterone, the way that micronized progesterone is. And because of that, you don't get many of the really beautiful benefits that progesterone has for the body, including the release of this really nice neurosteroid called allopregnanolone. And it's something that gets released when progesterone is being broken down in the body. And it stimulates these receptors in our brain that are known for making us feel calm and relaxed. And it's really good for us. Like it promotes neuroplasticity, which means that it makes our brain plastic and malleable and able to respond to things and not, freak out. And it's associated with having better mental health and all these other really beautiful things. And women who are using synthetic hormones, this progestin, that because it's made out of testosterone, it's not made out of progesterone, you don't get this beautiful metabolite that has all these wonderful benefits to the brain and benefits to mental health and also benefits to bone health because progesterone and estrogen work together to help to create new osteoblasts in the bone and help to strengthen bones and do all these really nice things. And I think that there's a lot of doctors out there who are just because they're comfortable with the birth control pill, they're just like giving women that to try to prevent them from not experiencing the symptoms of the menopausal transition. But they're the women that aren't getting all the benefits you get from actual hormones.
I've never even heard that before.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, no, I hear about this. So, of course, women reach out to me with their questions. And one of the questions I get a lot is about the use of birth control in menopause and like whether or not, that's recommended and is it the same as using hormone therapy with, biologically identical hormones? And, the answer is no, because you don't get all those great benefits. And it does, tend to have this side effect profile that's really unfavorable to women.
Wow. Thanks for telling me that.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Sarah, thank you for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is so fun.
This was so fun. Did I miss anything? Is there anything else we should talk about?
I don't think so. I think we talked about things I didn't even think we were going to talk about.
I know your personal life.
We talked about my personal life.
I know. Thank you for sharing because
Yes, of course.
I think a lot of people can relate to that too. I think it's real life, and it's I'm somebody that like is very much someone who's interested in like the nitty gritty of someone beyond all this other stuff. I want to get to know you as a person. So thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me.
Where do people find you or more information on what you're doing or your book?
Yes, of course. You can find me on all social platforms, and I'm at Sarah E. Hill, Ph.D., and that's Sarah with an H. So Sarah E. Hill, Ph.D. And my website is sarahehill.com. And my book, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, is sold everywhere that books are sold. And you can also find my new book that'll be coming out in September called The Period Brain in September.
I didn't know that. Thank you guys. Go follow Sarah. She's awesome.
Thanks.
The period brain?
The period brain. It is about the untold science of why we PMS and how to fix it.
Are you serious?
Yes, I'm like super excited about it.
I didn't know you had another book coming out.
I know. It's I just finished writing it. I actually just got the proofs today. We've been picking out the cover and it's going to be coming out in
what cover
September.
is that going to be?
It's actually really cool. It's like pink, but it's got kind of a reddish hue, as you might imagine.
Oh my God, hilarious.
Yeah, no, it looks really good. I'm really excited about it.
Oh my gosh, that is I love that.
Thanks. I'm really excited about it.
Okay, I'm gonna